I wrote this sermon several weeks ago, as I ordinarily do, and then come to it the week that we preach. And this morning, I got up and I read this passage from the lectionary text out of Philippians chapter 2. It says this: "Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross." Today is Palm Sunday, and many times in Palm Sunday we kind of celebrate Jesus riding into Jerusalem, as we did with the kids coming with the leaves. But this Palm Sunday, we're going to walk through the story of Holy Week. We're going to walk with Jesus as he is with his disciples at the Last Supper, as he makes his way to the garden, as he is on trial, and as he is crucified. It's a week, this week, Holy Week. You hear that word, and you'll hear that word maybe even this week. It's Holy Week. It's a week that's leading up to Easter. Easter's next Sunday. Easter's a high point, perhaps the highest point on the Christian calendar, right? But as we make our way there, I think we have to go all the way back to where we were when snow was on the ground and we were gathered together, the beginning of Epiphany, walking through the ministry of Jesus. We've now been in Lent for 5 weeks, and this is the final week of Lent. You get to eat chocolate again right after next Sunday, or whatever you gave up. But we're making our way toward Easter. So this morning, I'm going to ask you to find a Bible. So find a Bible. You're going to have one if you're going to follow along this morning. And we're going to walk through the text together. We're going to walk through this story together. And I hope that it will bring life, and I hope that you can kind of get lost in this story as we do this. We're not going to have one reading. The lectionary text will be long for today, so we're not going to read it all in one sitting. We're just going to walk through it together. You're going to find parts of the story where I'm not reading the text. We're just kind of telling the story. Other parts will be reading it together. So again, you'll want to have this Bible open in front of you. And I didn't even tell you where to turn, did I? You already knew. Matthew chapter 26 and 27 is where you want to go. Let's think about, though, where we have been so far in this story, what has brought us to this place. Again, all the way back in January, we began with Jesus' baptism. And I don't know if you remember that, but Jesus goes out to be with John in the desert, and he is baptized. And when Jesus is baptized, Matthew chapter 3, verse 17 says, "And a voice from heaven said, 'This is my Son, whom I love, and with him I am well pleased.'" Very beginning. In the bookend of Jesus' ministry. And then we have Jesus going out. He's gathering disciples. He's traveling from town to town. He's healing people. He's preaching. We read in Matthew chapter 5, if you remember, the Sermon on the Mount. We spent a few weeks in that. We learned that Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom that's very different from our cultural kingdoms, right? It's a kingdom that's about giving up. It's a kingdom about releasing our own will. It's a kingdom that is about laying down our own rights. And so Jesus goes, he's preaching, he's teaching. We find out as he encounters people, he heals them. On a number of occasions he heals people. But his healing is not simply for the sake of healing. Jesus' healing is for the sake of identifying who he is. You might remember the story of the Transfiguration. Jesus takes 3 of his closest companions, Peter, James, and John, and they go to a tall mountain, and there Jesus is transformed before them, transfigured, if you will. Moses and Elijah appear, and they're talking about this departure, this exodus that Jesus is about to go on. Again, it's Moses' exodus is a mission of salvation, but Jesus' exodon, departure, will be a mission of salvation also, but in a different, more all-encompassing sort of way. And so as they're standing there with Jesus on that mountainside, just the same as his baptism, a voice from heaven proclaims what? The same thing. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. It seems that through Jesus' ministry, everything he does, everything he says is all about that one thing, revealing that he is the Son of God. It's about pointing people toward what he has come to do. When he heals the blind man, we talked about that 2 weeks ago. The purpose is that everyone would know that he is the Son of God. Remember, he sent him to the pool called Sent. Why? Because he would say, I am the sent one of God. And then last week, the story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. Again, it is about people understanding who he is, believing in him. It's not about the blind man. It's not about Lazarus. It's about Jesus' identity, who he is. And so this week, we come to this final week in Jesus' earthly life, and really the culmination of his mission. He has come to show us that he is God's Son come to save the world. So that's what we're doing this morning. He's been walking around for 3 years. He's been pouring into the lives of his disciples, and now he comes to this final week. Let me invite you to open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26 this morning, and we're going to walk through the text together. It begins here with Jesus at the Last Supper, the last meal with his disciples, and we hear Jesus' words. They're having this conversation about someone who is going to betray Jesus, and they're all asking, is it me? Am I the one? Look at verse 25. Then Judas, the one who would betray him, said, surely not I, Rabbi. Jesus answered, yes, it is you. The scene quickly changes to Jesus' words in verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. When he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So Jesus gathering with his disciples, he's teaching them, he's showing them what he is about to do. They travel out to the Mount of Olives. Jesus then tells them information that is even more disturbing. Look at verse 31. Then Jesus told them, this very night you will all fall away on account of me. For it's written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. You know, in the Last Supper, he was saying, one of you is going to betray me. But now he's saying, all of you are going to jump ship. All of you are going to leave. Peter speaks up when he says this. Peter says, no way, Jesus, not me. I won't do that. I won't leave you. But Jesus assures him that he will. Look at verse 34. I tell you the truth, Jesus answered. This very night, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. Jesus goes with his disciples to a place of prayer. He says, look guys, I want you to stay awake and pray with me. And they fall asleep. Jesus prays, Father, would you take this cup from me? Is there any other way? You see, he feels the weight. He feels the anxiety of what he's about to do. He knows what it means. And Jesus is in agony as he prays. Isn't there some other way? Listen to his words in verse 39. Going a little farther, he fell on his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken away from me. Yet, not as I will, but as you will. He prays this prayer 3 times. He keeps checking in on his disciples, and every time he goes back, they're sleeping. Jesus is in anguish again. The full weight of what he is about to do is on him, and he is tempted to bail, tempted to leave, tempted to go some other way. Yet through that time of praying, again, so intense, we understand that he's sweating drops of blood. But as he prays, God is telling him, no, there's no other way. The Father is telling him, this is how you must do it. And so as he does this, he cements his will to fulfill his mission, to die for the sins of the world. All the while, his disciples are snoozing. Verse 45, then he returned to the disciples and said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near. and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. Look at the words here. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Judas has come and he is there to betray Jesus. Judas kisses Jesus to identify him. How ironic, isn't it? To betray with a kiss. Look at Jesus' words here. Jesus knows what he's about to do. He knows how this is all going to end. And look at verse 50. Jesus replied, "Friend, do what you came for." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. The disciples, the guys who have been sleeping the whole time, they decide they're going to do something now, right? So Peter steps up. He's trying to fight. He pulls his sword out, and he takes off one of the guards' ears. Jesus responds, verse 52. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him. "For all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" I want you to notice Jesus' posture here. Jesus is on purpose, isn't he? He understands what he's doing. He reminds Peter, look, I'm in control here. I haven't lost control. These guys aren't doing to me what I don't want them to do to me. I'm right in the middle of God's will, of the Father's will. He reminds him, look, I can call off the whole thing. He says there are 12 legions, and by some interpretations, that means up to 72,000 angels, okay? That Jesus could snap his fingers, and they would be there, and they would rescue him out of this ordeal. Jesus says, look, I'm in control. We're not fighting here. We're going, and we're going to do what the Father has told us to do. Jesus is stepping into danger to rescue you and me out of danger. He tells him, look, you don't need swords here for this sort of things. We're not going to put up a fight. It doesn't operate with weapons. And look at verse 56. But all this, he says, has taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled. I encourage you this week to read the story again. Don't let this be the last time you read it before you come here on Easter Sunday. Read it again. And I want you to notice how many times Jesus says the prophets are being fulfilled. What was said long ago, that's what's happening now. Even down to the number of coins that Judas has, you see. It's all fulfilled. And Jesus understands that he's on a mission, and he's on a mission. He's laser focused. Verse 56. Then the disciples deserted him and fled. They did exactly what Jesus said they would do. They freaked out and they ran away. This is exactly what Jesus said would happen. They take Jesus to Caiaphas, the high priest. They hold a mock trial and they bring in false witnesses. They're looking for a way to get Jesus out of the picture. See, they're tired of Jesus going around healing people. Jesus is drawing a lot of attention. They're tired of him saying that he's God come, you see. And so they're going to get him out of the picture. They bring up all sorts of stuff in this trial. And the whole time, Jesus is just standing there. Finally, the high priest is ticked off. You see, Jesus turning the other cheek, Jesus standing there in silence, it's making him very uncomfortable. You see, if you're standing before the high priest, you're supposed to be scared. You're supposed to be shaking in your boots. You're supposed to be defending yourself. You're supposed to be saying, I'm not guilty of all of this. And Jesus is just standing there silent. I suppose that his jaw is clenched because he's so resolute. He understands what he's doing, and he's standing there silent. Look at verse 62. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent. The high priest has finally had enough. Verse 63, the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. You see, this is what Jesus has been saying over and over again, right? I am the Son of God. I have come so that you may believe. I'm healing this blind man so that you may believe. Lazarus, he's risen from the dead so that you may believe that what? That I am the Son of God. He said this over and over again. And when the high priest asked him, are you the Son of God? Jesus responds, verse 64, yes, it is as you say. But I say to all of you, in the future, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Yes, he says, I am God come. Yes, it is just as you say. Yes, yes, yes. And Jesus knows when he says this. Jesus knows when he says that this is true, that in many ways he has declared himself guilty of what the men are accusing him of. Look what happens when Jesus says this. The high priest tears his clothes. He begins screaming, he's spoken blasphemy. They've decided then that Jesus must die. They're determined to kill him. Do you see Jesus' control the whole time? Do you see the precision here? Jesus is silent. He's not saying a word. And when he speaks, he says just the thing that's going to get him killed. And he says it on purpose. Number one, because it's true. Number two, because he understands he has come to die. He knows he's going to get him killed, but he says it anyways. Verse 67, they abused Jesus. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped him and said, prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you? I want to go back to Jesus' words in the garden here. And we cannot forget this. Through the whole ordeal, Jesus has the power to call 72,000, 12 legions of angels from heaven at any moment and rescue him and deliver him back into his Father's arms. He can do it at any moment. And here these men are kicking him. They're spitting on him. They're mocking him. He is the one who created them. He is the one who keeps their hearts beating. And yet they're spitting and mocking on him. And all the while, Jesus could call it off at any minute. And he doesn't. He allows them to do it. Why? Because of you and me. Why? Because he knows that our sins cannot be forgiven unless he dies on a cross over and over again. Again, Jesus could take these guys out in one word, but yet he allows them to continue. The whole time, Peter is not far away. Matthew tells us that he was following close behind. He was sitting by the fire in the courtyard, and a servant girl comes up to him and says, aren't you the man who was with Jesus? She recognizes him. She speaks up, or Peter speaks up and says, no, that's not me. You've got me mistaken for somebody else. Again, Peter responds out of fear. Goes a little bit further. Another girl comes up to him. This is the fellow who was with Jesus of Nazareth. Again, Peter refutes her. Look at how Matthew describes it, verse 72. He denied it again with an oath. I don't know the man. I swear to God I don't know him. That's what he's saying. Finally, others from the crowd will not let it drop. They listen to his accent and they say, yeah, he's the one. Listen how he's talking. He's just like those guys. He sounds like he's with Jesus. Again, a third time, Peter says in verse 4, then he began to call down curses on himself, and he swore to them, I don't know the man. Immediately, a rooster crowed. You see, the language is strong here. The one who said, I'll never deny you, Jesus, denies him. The one who pulled out the sword to defend Jesus, he caves into his own fear. Do you notice the story? How at every point in the story, Jesus is resolute, Jesus is on mission, Jesus is faithful. Everybody around him is unfaithful. The ones who say, I'll fight with you to the end, they're caving in, they're deserting him, and Peter is now denying Jesus. Verse 75. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. Meanwhile, the high priest is more determined than ever to kill Jesus, and so he hands him over to the Romans. You see, the Jews did not have the right to enact the death penalty, so they had to hand him over to the Romans so that he could be killed. Judas is evidently in the room. He didn't know it was going to come to this. There's been a lot of speculation on as to who Judas was and why he did what he did. Many believe that Judas was a zealot, and he believed that if he could force Jesus into a corner, that he would act, and he would come out and he would take the Romans out. That's what Judas thought. And Judas is understanding that it's not going to go down like this. It's not going to happen like he thought that it would. And Jesus is standing there silent. Jesus is going to get killed, he thinks. Look at verse 3 of this is Matthew 27, verse 3. He was seized with remorse. Can you imagine being in his shoes? Can you imagine feeling the pain and the sorrow of betraying Jesus? He can't take it anymore. Verse 5. So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. As we're reading this week, again, I want you to notice even the number of coins. Even the number of coins is predicted by the prophets. Everything that's happening here is something, it's a plan. God knew what he was doing. Jesus is transported from the high priest's place to Pilate. Pilate is the Roman governor. We read in verse 11, meanwhile, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. You see, Pilate doesn't know how to make sense of all of this. He doesn't understand why Jesus is silent. Do you not hear what they're saying about you, Pilate says? Do you not understand? Pilate says that I could have you killed. And again, Pilate's confused because most people who come before the governor with the death sentence kind of on the horizon are shaking in their boots. And yet Jesus is standing there. He's not defending himself. He seems resolute. He seems on purpose. And Pilate does not understand it. Pilate says, "Don't you understand? They want you dead." Matthew describes Jesus in verse 14. But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. You see, Pilate doesn't get it. Do you see the sort of control that Jesus has the whole time? Again, he's laser focused on his mission. Again, he is not about saving himself. He's on a mission to save you and me. Jesus is not about protecting his own self-interest. He is giving up himself for you and me. He knows the will of the Father. He knows how this thing is going to end. Let me remind you, at any point, he still could have called 72,000 angels to rescue him, but he doesn't. He just stands there and he takes it. He stands there. He's going in, doing what he knows he needs to do. Pilate knows what's going on here. He knows it is because of the jealousy and the envy of the religious leaders that Jesus is on trial. He knows their power has been threatened. Matthew tells us in verse 18, for he knew that it was out of envy that they handed Jesus over to him. And Pilate, he's a pretty smart guy, I'm sure. And he's a governor, right? He's got an idea. And he figures that if he can just follow this through, that Jesus will be released and he will have escaped the possibility of condemning an innocent man. It was the Passover, and at every Passover there was a custom that the governor would release a prisoner to the people. And so Pilate thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll get the worst prisoner that I can find, and I'll put him up against Jesus, and they won't have a choice. They'll have to release Jesus. And so he gets this guy named Barabbas. Look at verse 6. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. Now, think about some notorious prisoners that we've had in the United States. I want to show you this picture of Charles Manson. Pretty scary guy, don't you think? He was able to manipulate cult followers to murder. I mean, he was a crazy man. Now, he's still alive, 79 years old now. Probably not as scary as he used to be, but can you imagine if word got out that Charles Manson was going to be released, right? Would you want him moving next door to you? Would you want him living in your community? Would you want him working in your kid's school? I don't think so, right? This is the sort of guy that Barabbas is. And so they bring Barabbas out, and Pilate thinks, if I can just put Barabbas next to Jesus, the notorious, violent, crazy man, versus the peace man who heals people, it'll be a no-brainer, right? And so Pilate brings them out. You imagine Pilate sitting in the judge's seat, Barabbas on one side, and Jesus on the other. At the same time, Pilate's wife comes in. Look at verse 19. While Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him this message: "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Who knows what happened in her dream? Nobody really knows. Who knows what she had suffered because of this dream? And Pilate says, well, don't worry, honey. I've got a plan. We're going to put Barabbas up there and Jesus up there. Surely they will let Jesus go. Don't worry about it. It's under control. So he offers the option to the crowd. Matthew tells us that the religious leaders somehow convinced the crowd to choose Barabbas. Pilate is floored. He doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. He says, well, if you want me to let Barabbas go, then what am I supposed to do with Jesus? And the crowd begins to chant, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate can't understand this. He doesn't get it. But the religious leaders have made their way through the crowd. The religious leaders have worked this out so that Jesus will be killed. Same time, Pilate doesn't really feel like Jesus should die, but he knows that his job is on the line. Matthew 24, or verse 24 of chapter 27, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood," he said. "It is your responsibility." All the people answered, "Let his blood be on us and our children." How prophetic. You see, they're speaking in terms of blame. Jesus' blood. We'll take the responsibility, we'll take the blame, but how prophetic that his blood would be on them and their children. And his blood is on us today, isn't it? And on our children. You see, Jesus' blood is not about blame, it's about forgiveness. So Pilate does what he knows deep inside he should not do. Verse 26, then he released Barabbas to them. Wonder what damage he did in the future, right? But he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. See, the ball is rolling. It will not stop. Jesus is going to be killed. His death is inevitable. As we continue the text this morning, let me just say, it's more than we can study in one sitting, isn't it? More than we can take, more than we have time to walk through. But what happens next is absolutely unbelievable. Jesus willingly gives his life for the sins of the world. This has been the subject of movies, of books, of theological treatises. We won't unpack the entire scene this morning. But let me encourage you to read the story this week. Let me encourage you to take time out of your schedule this week and open this. Take your bulletin, put it in your Bible right in that spot, and just open it back up to Matthew chapter 27 and walk through it on Thursday. Walk through it on Friday. By the way, on Friday we're gathering here. If you have a lunch hour, let me encourage you to come here to this place at noon on Friday. It'll be full in here. This room will be packed with people from all over the community. Willie Jackson will be preaching as we think about, as we reflect on the fact that Jesus died for our sins on Good Friday at noon. Come here to this place and let's do this together. But what is happening next? Jesus is beaten. He's mocked. He's nailed to the cross. He suffers the wrath of God for the sins of the world. He fulfills his mission. He does not falter. He does not veer off course. Again, he could have called angels down to rescue him at any moment. But he's in total control, total submission, and he carries it out. He dies for you and for me. I want to point to one more verse here this morning as we close our time together. Look at what Matthew records in verse 54. The pagan onlookers, in response to what they had experienced that day, said this: when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and all that had happened, they were terrified and exclaimed, "Surely he was the Son of God." All the way back to Jesus' baptism, a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son." On the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus transformed, standing there with Moses and Elijah, and a voice from heaven says, "This is my Son." And that day, on a hill outside of Jerusalem, Jesus is hanging there, his lifeless body on the cross, and the words out of the mouth of a Roman centurion says, "This is the Son of God." You see, all that Jesus had said, all that he did, point to the fact that he is God come for us. You see, even the pagans, when they looked on, they had no other response but to say, "The Son of God has come." You see, as we make our way toward Easter in this final week of Lent, let's live in this story. We've walked through it together this morning. We don't want to forget it. We don't want to just let the week go by and just be another week. It's Holy Week. What do we mean by that? It's Holy Week. That means it's a week that is set apart, a week that is special, a week that, we should be living in this story every week of the year, right? But certainly this week, we need to live in this story. I'm not sure how this finds you this morning. I'm not sure if you're listening this morning and you're going, "I never really thought about that before." Maybe this morning God would be speaking to you in some way and you need to respond. Maybe this morning you would be like the Roman centurion going, "As we've looked at this and as I look at this, I can say nothing other than this is the Son of God." And you need to confess that this morning. Maybe you would come forward this morning. Maybe God is speaking to your heart in some way and you just want to privately pray this morning. The altar is open for you to come and pray. The band's going to come back up now. We're going to take some time to respond. So let me invite you all to stand as we sing and proclaim this morning.